record on live transcript enable. We're going to turn this on as well because everything needs to be in duplicate and triplicate lest I lose any of this. Mm-hmm. Be the worst. Okay, so part of this is scripted, so I do have things that I will follow, but the intention of it is to be a fairly fluid conversation otherwise. So, we'll go from that. So, thank you for joining me today in this one-on-one interview. As you know, the aim of this interview is to hear more about your experiences as it relates to the domains of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Your participation in this interview is voluntary, and if at any point you'd like to step out, take a break, pause, or end early, you're absolutely welcome to do so. Just let me know. These interviews, as you know, will be recorded and the transcripts will be generated, but they will be anonymized, so no names or identifiers will be carried forward. With all that being said, do I have your consent to start?
Yes.
Thank you. And then before we get started, do you have any questions for me?
Nope.
Perfect. For the record and logistical gathering, can you please state your age, your gender, and your role at the Cancer Center?
My age is 37. Yes, 37. And then I'm a medical oncology resident at the Cancer Center. And what was the third thing? Sorry?
Gender.
Oh, female.
Excellent. All right. So the first question is me asking you to essentially define or explain in your own words 3 terms. So that's that part of it. So how would you define or explain to someone the term equity?
So I always have to think of it in terms of equity versus equality. I think equality assumes everybody is given the exact same opportunity to apply for something or do something, but equity recognizes that people have different needs, and so they'll allocate resources so that one person has what they need to get the same outcome as somebody else fairly. That's my understanding of it.
For sure. And then how would you define or explain the term diversity to someone?
I think diversity is more demographics based. It can be race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, different things like that. A diversity meaning a broad coming together of all those different things as opposed to having a group of people be isolated in terms of a demographic feature.
Absolutely. And then lastly, how would you define or explain the term inclusivity?
So I think that means in its true spirit, I think it means that everybody who's included in an activity actually feels respected and welcome to be there, as opposed to being a token, this or that. You need to feel welcome and yeah.
All right. So, keeping those themes and ideas in mind, how do you see, or rather, do you see these domains influencing patient-clinician interactions, and if so, in what ways?
I think they can definitely play a role in patient-clinician interactions. One of the more obvious ones that comes to mind, I think, is sometimes when you're working with an elderly patient. I think sometimes you speak slower, more loudly. Sometimes they need that, sometimes they don't, but you're assuming. And I think sometimes when that's the case, you make an assumption that they can't process the same information, and you might say things at a more lay level, if that makes sense. When you haven't even really explored to them, you just sort of default to that. I think that that's a situation where you kind of make assumptions. Is that the kind of answer that you're getting at?
Yeah, I mean, really the idea of, do you think they matter? And at the end of the day, why and how?
Yeah. So I think that kind of interaction matters. As a resident once, I sat down on a bed and I was speaking very loudly with a patient, and she was elderly and she was like, "I'm not deaf. You don't need to yell." And I was like, and it was just kind of it's like my doctor voice when I'm rounding, but, I made her feel like I wasn't either taking her seriously. And so of course that matters, right? How she feels, and that can affect the therapeutic relationship. And patients can also tell if they feel that you're being patronizing by not giving them information or speaking very slowly and deliberately to them. I think that just gives them a sense of how you're viewing them. And if you're doing that, that patient may not always feel like in a position to correct you. and let you know. So already, you're undermining their autonomy, maybe even their dignity, things like that. So I think whenever we make assumptions about people like that, I think it always matters because you don't always know how it's affecting them. They may not be able to speak up and say that.
Yeah.
I think that's the best example that I can come up with, but I know that there are other ways in which those sorts of things happen, and I think it always matters.
For sure. I think really in that very much that same vein, the next question is, have you encountered or participated in an encounter in the clinical sphere where these domains played a role, whether it meant influencing the patient's decision-making, establishing trust while you were breaking bad news, like just that clinician-patient relationship that you engaged in?
I'm sure there is. I'm trying to think of like a sort of a clear example. Coming from the other direction, I've certainly had patients be like, really, I'm going to talk to you, like not my staff, or they'll be like, oh, you look too young to be able to properly advise me, or like they're like, oh, you're so young, but the subtext under it makes me feel like they won't have the confidence in anything that I'm saying. And so, I always try and be like, well, why don't we start? Let's see if I can help you and if I can address some of your needs and concerns, right? But I've never felt comfortable rebounding back and being like, that's not really an appropriate comment. You know what I mean? Right. I just kind of more want to get through the encounter, because I feel like if I was to say I didn't really appreciate that, then they'd be like, oh, so I can see it from that part. And then I feel like, are they going to hear what I'm saying? Am I actually the best person to help them if they're from the bat, So that's maybe the opposite way than what you were thinking. Let's see. I had a patient who I spoke with, and at the end of our visit, she disclosed to me that she was First Nations, and allowed me to then make a referral to our sort of our Aboriginal navigator. And I thanked her for disclosing that. And I don't know if that would have happened if I had made other judgments or preconceived things and how I approached the appointment earlier on. And, it was a bit telling to me that she waited till the end to do that, because I think they have to feel comfortable with who they're talking to. And I don't know, I'm not trying to say that that's a generalization to everybody, but I think in her case, she may not have felt comfortable until she kind of sussed out how the relationship and the therapeutic conversation was going to go. So I think those things always matter. I'm sorry, Shivani, I'm probably not giving you good examples.
No, these are great. I guess even as you reflect and think of other things perhaps that may come to mind, what specifically in those encounters, the one that you've established, what tools, resources, words, like what were things that you fell back on to move the conversation forward? Like what were, internal triggers that you had that you're like, oh, I should explore this a bit further, but how can I establish that in a trusting way?
So I know before you said something along the lines of delivering bad news. So when I'm talking to patients, I recognize that while this is run of the mill for me, it's not for them. And while I see many patients like this in a week or that, to them, they're the one that matters. So I always parse information in like little parcels. And at the end, I'll pause and I'll say, what do you think about that? And I'll just kind of like sit there even uncomfortably, and it's just see if I can give them room to process and really make them feel like they can ask questions. The other fallback that I often say is, you're the most important person in this room, and you have the power. You're driving this plan. My job here is to give you information that you need, but my job is to work with you to achieve your goals. So, why don't we talk about what you want? What are you worried about? And make the focus about them, so that they, in a situation where they feel like they have no power, try and give some of that back to them and help them feel empowered. So like you're the boss or that kind of stuff. So I try to help them feel like they're driving it a little bit and let them feel that they can guide the conversation. And I always tell my patients, I say, you need to be comfortable with the plan. And if that means asking questions, please ask questions. You should never feel like you can't ask your doctor questions. Because like, this is a big deal, right? And so I said, there's no silly questions, right? I said, I've probably been asked them all. So I really try and normalize, those feelings, and the thought that they might worry that they're asking a silly question or this and that. So, and just really try and make it feel like they're running things, even though I have some of the answers.
For sure. Have you witnessed or been part of an encounter where someone else had to incorporate those domains and either did it very well and or did it very poorly?
Let's see. Absolutely. For sure. I'm trying to think of a good example. Let's see. So when I was a medical student, I had been working in a clinic, not at the Juravinsky, but I was with a staff, and they were seeing, which in my opinion felt like too many patients, a slot. But I was just a medical student, so I mean, who knows? But they would just like breeze in, talk to the patient, breeze out. Like they were the authority. They looked at the labs. What else could the patient contribute to the meeting? You're good. Blood work's fine. Here's your script. Good to go, right? And it felt like terrible, like it felt like really bad patient care. And like on more than one occasion, I had to stop because like the patient's family was looking at me like, didn't you tell them about this? You know, and I'm like, so I'd like literally be like, well, just wait a minute. The patient said that they were actually having this problem. And then, but it just always felt like they didn't want to stop and hear about that. They wanted to like treat the labs and not the patient. And I don't know if I caught them on like a bad day or what, but that's an example of where I thought it wasn't done very well, because it was just, it was about them and not about the patient.
Yeah. It also sounds very dehumanizing of the person.
Yeah. Right. So. Because I spent all that time with the family, and then, and I couldn't even get 2 words in. I came in to tell them about the patient, and they just were like, so blood work's this, and I'm like, but they also mentioned, and she's like, what's wrong in the room? And then that didn't materialize. So it was, I felt like I couldn't advocate for the patient as well as I wished, but we managed to get that issue taken care of, but like it was just a recurring theme. So I think that's an example of where it was not well done. Recently I saw a patient in my longitudinal clinic, and the son just having lots of problems understanding and being okay with the patient's diagnosis. Recently found to be metastatic in a worrisome spot here at C6, so it could compromise breathing, arms, legs, like that kind of thing. And, I've been seeing them and talking to them for like 4 or 5 weeks now, both in person and on the phone. And, I disclosed all of the new findings to them, and the son, like, he's like nodding along, he's got this binder full of stuff. He's got notes written down, and he's like, so what even is this kind of cancer? And I'm like, what? And so I opened his book and I said, see, I circled these, we went through this, and he's like, well, what even stage is this? And I said, well, that's what we just finished talking about that, it's a stage 4, it's incurable. And then he started to get really upset, I think, because maybe I didn't do the best job. I probably shouldn't have said, like, I circled this before, like as if like pointing out, like, don't you remember? But I didn't mean it that way, but I can see that it might have been taken that way. So then he started to get upset, and he's like, well, who puts all this information together? He's like, whose job is it to like tell me about the results of all these scans? And I said, that's what I've been doing, and he said, well, I want to see pictures. And I said, okay, that's fine. Thank you for telling me that you need to see these images. I'll find a way to, and he was like, this should be standard of care as a concerned taxpayer, like, and he just got really upset. And so I think it was just a combination of things there. And so, I recognize that our therapeutic relationship was probably not what he needed at that moment. Meanwhile, it was clear his dad understood what was going on, because he was talking, I'm not sure I want treatment. He's like, I just want to be made comfortable, like, but the son was having lots of problems. Wasn't okay with his dad saying that I don't want treatment. He was like, you have to explore all the options. And I was like, well, he really doesn't if he doesn't want to. And that made him very upset as well. So it was my longitudinal clinic. So I got my staff to come in, because I recognized that they probably needed a staff. I'm a resident. I'm telling them that this is incurable. We can't do anything. This is a very scary met. Your dad is not fit enough to get chemotherapy. We're going to do radiation. It's only going to be a stopgap. And right. So I think I did the right thing in that scenario by responding the way I did. But when my staff came in, they just had a really good approach to things. I had explained what went on and what I had identified were the problems. So she was able to go in there and address each of them. Like, we moved them to a room where there was a computer. We pulled up the images, walked them through everything, like spent that time. And that was what he needed to like de-escalate and see with his eyes, the evidence, right? He was just having a hard time with it. And, so she would pause, are you with me so far? And that kind of thing. And so I think that was an example of where something was really well done by her. She recognized where the issues and gaps were and kind of met him where he was at, and that kind of thing. So
recognizing that, the approach to someone else would be very, very different than in this person's case.
Yeah.
Well, do you think in reflection that, because you said, part of it was, he heard it again from a different person. But do you think part of it was him trusting the fact that it was a staff person who was clearly older than you?
I think so. I think that definitely contributes for sure. For sure. When there's really tough news and somebody's having a hard time, I think they want to hear it from someone in authority. Like I feel like he was on the verge of being like, I want a second opinion kind of thing. And so before he kind of, I said, would you like to talk to my staff? I said, I review everything by her. I was like, but would you like to talk to her? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting though, because, one wonders, it's like, if you looked different or if you were a different person, would that still have been the case?
Yeah. I think, unpacking my baggage, like in medical school, we do that. What is unpack your biases or your backpack of privilege? That's the one, privilege. And I'm probably very fortunate in that the only thing that was identified in that exercise is that I'm a girl. So I've definitely been in scenarios where I'm with a male and they're more looking at them than me. In this case, it was two women. But clearly I was a resident. I have the tag as being a resident, right? And I'm younger and that kind of thing. So I think that I think that can contribute, and the other thing is sometimes it's not just that it's me, it's that, in other cases, they have a longitudinal relationship with the staff. So yesterday I was in a telephone clinic and I tried to talk to a patient, and at the very start he was like, oh, I thought I was going to be talking with Dr. So-and-so.
Yeah. And
I said, well, he's asked me to call you. And he's like, well, I guess if I don't have a choice. And I said, look, you always have a choice. I said, you don't have to talk to me if you don't want to. I said, but did you want to start and see if I can help you? And then let's check in and see if you still want me to get Dr. So-and-so to give you a call after, And so at the end, he was like, not exactly apologetic, but he was like, thank you. Like, that actually really helps. Thanks for taking the time to explain all this stuff. And it's funny because I don't know if a staff would have the time to do all that.
Yeah.
But I was like, look, I said, I know you really were hoping to speak with Dr. So-and-so. Do you want them to just touch base with you? And, and he, that would be great. So it's also that, right? You have that relationship with somebody, and all of a sudden there's this resident who you don't know flying in, he's like, do you even know my history? And I was like, yeah, I do actually.
You're like, I read.
So sometimes you feel like you're being judged, like on a trait or something, but sometimes it's not really that.
Yeah.
Right? Like that telephone one, it wasn't about that. Yeah. Maybe in the room with my patient in my clinic, maybe it was a little bit about that.
For sure. And then how do you keep that, because again, we are human, so how do you keep that response in check where there is that like sudden thing, I was like, is it because of how I look, what gender I present with, how young I am? Like, how do you keep that in check?
That's a good question. Probably practice. Practice, and I don't mean this to sound bad, but I think so. I think the way I was raised as a girl, and with my mom's own history and baggage, she very much prefers to fly under the radar and keep things close to the vest. Like, other people shouldn't know what your dirty laundry is, kind of thing, or what your trauma is, or what's going on, right? You should be like calm on the surface, even if you're like furiously pedaling under the water, right? So that I often, while that's maybe not the best life view, I can sometimes use that to just be calm about whatever's happening at the moment, even if underneath I'm like, what is going on? That's not fair, or I could help you, that kind of thing. So doing that. And I think the other thing that, I use to help with that is I tell myself, I'm like, this person is in distress. Mm-hmm. They're in distress. This is not their best moment. Okay. When you're not in your best moment, like when I'm not in my best moment, right? Things I say or do things that I might not otherwise, or I just advocate the only way that I think I can. I might make snap judgments, and they're only human too, right? Right. And so if I'm meeting them on their worst day sometimes. And so I think it helps to remind myself that they are also only human, and this may not be who they are all the time. They've clearly got people in their corner, they're just doing the best that they can. And when I tell myself that, then it's a lot easier to kind of de-escalate, and I can debrief after if I really feel that something was, if it left a bad taste in my mouth. I know that there's staff here that would support me in debriefing after and just talking about it and helping me unpack what happened. Is it just my problem? I just took offense when I shouldn't have, or was there something there that that was unfortunate? And how can I respond to differently next time? So I think those are some of the tools that I would use in that scenario. And depending on the scenario, sometimes you just call them out on it. You have to be very careful about that.
So, you've mentioned a number of tools and strategies. So, in that vein, as we go into our next question, have you ever received any formal or informal training or teaching in regards to EDI within the clinical setting, really as it translated to your role as a resident?
The only thing that I think comes close is an academic half day that we had around First Nations or Aboriginal patients and the healthcare system. I think that's what the talk was on, and it was to provide us with context and perspective, and to let us know that there are resources for these patients. And I think also a little bit to make us aware of any biases or things like that. So I think that was a deliberate sort of attempt to educate residents about things that really scratches the surface. Mm-hmm. It's only about, while commendable, it's about one group of people. And I think everybody could stand to learn a little bit more about everybody else, and just I think even more general training about where, we might have to have a half day where we unpack our own biases, right? Unpack your privilege. Take that, Harvard bias test. They have a bunch of different ones, right? Really take the time to sit in your uncomfort at recognizing that you have these prejudices that you don't even know because you grew up one way and the media was one way and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot more that we could do, but that is the only example that I can think of where we've actually had specific training from a program level. There was a women in medicine, I think it was a women in medicine conference, maybe a year ago or something. That symposium. And you could choose to be a part of, I think, an EDI talk, or it was a keynote talk, or Dr. Sonia,
Anand?
I'm totally blank. Yes, thank you, Anand. I totally blanked on her last name, but unless you search that kind of thing out, I don't think that, I don't think it's obvious in our training. And I think the people that are most likely to search that out are people that have experienced it in some way, shape, or form and want to know how to do better. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's not always the people that need it.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that, in your residency that hasn't been the case, and you earlier mentioned that in med school there were those opportunities to unpack your biases. Were there any other instances in your, personal life where you were given opportunities to seek out this training or this information?
I want to say sadly no.
So how did you learn about it? How have you, made yourself part of the conversation, or how have you gained skills if it was never taught to you?
So the first time I think I really became aware of this huge gap really and truly was in medical school. I was very fortunate in how I was raised, in that I didn't have a lot of prejudice directed at me. And so I was really naive. I just didn't think that it really existed. Do you know what I mean? Like it didn't occur to me that it was a problem. And then in medical school, when we started doing those exercises, and then we actually had a talk, from a First Nations physician, on residential schools. And I just was like, oh my God, like what? And that probably sounds like, how could I have not known that? Mm-hmm. Like, shouldn't it have been taught in history and like things like that? But like, I remember it not being taught well. I remember it being glazed over, and I remember hearing about it once or twice in the past, but it was never framed that way. And I was like horrified, and I realized that there was a lot that I probably didn't know about the patients that I was seeing and meeting every day. I think that you also have to be up with the current events of the time. All of the Black Lives Matter. I got stuck actually in a protest where some of the First Nations people blocked the 403, and I was on my way home, and I had a really rough day, and I just wanted to go home and see my son. And I'd known that there'd been these rolling like protests, but I didn't know obviously that it was going to be there at that time. And I had to catch him before bedtime. I was getting home that late, and I just wanted to get home, and I just sat in the car and I was just bawling. I was bawling because I didn't get to see my son. And I was like, how dare these people like go and pick it at City Hall, And then when I had time to like reflect, I was like, those people were doing it because they lost their kids. They never got to go. I got to go home and see him the next morning. And they never got to, in some cases. And I was just horrified that my gut reaction was, how dare these people, right? Like, how dare me?
That's hard. That's so incredibly hard, because our worldviews are centered on us, like our lived experiences. And it takes a lot of effort to look external to yourself, to humanize someone else's lived experience, especially when it is directly inconvenient to you.
Yeah, exactly. I tried then to do a little bit of reading. I must admit, residency is busy. I have ordered some books. Like I think last year when Black Lives Matter was really prominent, I started following a few key people on Twitter that were strong advocates for it, and they'd posted some books, right? Because they're like, don't ask us what we need, like do the work, right? And so I was like, okay, I got to do the work, right? Yeah. So I ordered some books, and I have them on like to read and educate myself more. So I think I've done some of the first steps of really like being open to what's out there and stuff, but I need to do more. But so those are some things that I think people can do to make themselves aware. And what I've done, you need to be up on current events. You need to be open to the fact that you might even be part of the problem, if not actively, passively, and try and do the work to be better.
And is that something that you've been told that you need to do, or is it a personal drive or motivation?
Personal. It was because I was just horrified that was my response after I had time to stop and reflect. Yeah. I was just like that, yeah.
And are there times when, seeking this out and trying to learn and trying to grow, like, is it hard? Is it uncomfortable? Are you ever tempted to not do it because it's unpleasant?
Yeah, for sure. 100%.
And so how do you bridge that, right?
I think I tell myself, like, what privilege to be able to feel uncomfortable about that. Mm-hmm. I have to remind myself about my position of privilege, and how it's my job to use that for better, and not to allow myself to skip being uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. That's huge, right? I think a lot of people would not willingly put themselves in that space, because it is so internally challenging to do so. And it takes work, and it takes time. And those are the two big things, right? When things take work and time, when you're already very busy.
Yeah.
Where are you going to find it?
Mm-hmm.
So in that vein, if you think back, how broadly comfortable do you feel when you're faced with these domains when it relates to your role as a physician? And what are some learning curves that you've set for yourself as you look forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like, what can I do in the clinic? It's hard because sometimes when you see a patient in clinic and you don't always know by looking at them, whether they're a vulnerable population or not, right? So, I think you always have to go in there with an open mind, and that can be tough because you have to like set aside whatever is going on with you that day and just meet the patient where they are, and then recognize that you have to just like isolate from what else is going on. Because if you don't do that opportunity, you might get off on the wrong foot right away. And I think that allowed me to have that other patient disclose to me her status, and then for me to provide some help. When I was talking to her, I said, thank you for disclosing that to me. I said, I know it's difficult interacting with our system. And then I paused and I said, you know what? I said, I don't know. I said, I can imagine it might be very difficult. And so I appreciate that you did that. So I think also sort of correcting yourself if you've made a mistake, and showing that you're willing to adopt or adapt. Sometimes when a visual cue leads you to believe, or an auditory, like English is a second language, or that something like that, that there's a minority person that you're seeing, I just try to realize that there might be some things that I might need to spend more time on, like language wise. I might also try to set aside any biases. Like if I see, I've seen a patient's husband speaking like almost entirely for the patient, and being like, well, that might just be a cultural thing, right? Like, while my culture is that kind of makes me go, oh, I'm worried, but that might just be the cultural thing, right? And so it's tough because you can't know all the things all the time. You can only school how you react in the moment. And so I think that the default has to be accepting and then unpacking things later with and trying to do that. So I'm definitely far from perfect. But I think I try to just keep an open mind and that kind of thing. But I don't feel like, I don't know, like maybe I'm 60% confident in how I deal in those situations, because you also don't want to be like, oh, this is a minority, I have to treat them specially. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's also the problem. Mm-hmm. I don't have the answers to that, and I just try to do my best. So I would say I'm probably like 60% confident. I think that was part of your question, right? How confident are you when you're in these situations? Like, but I try to be flexible. Mm-hmm. And respond. And if there's something that I have said or done that I can see puts them off, to pause in that moment and be like, I'm sorry, like, did I, check in and that kind of thing.
And so when you think back, you're near the end of your training at this point, mm-hmm. What are tools or resources that could have been useful thinking back to equip you better? I know you mentioned some of those things like bias training and being mm-hmm. in that space where you're faced with, acknowledging your privilege, but what are other things that mm-hmm. in reflection could have been really helpful for you?
I don't know if this is like bad to say or not, but like it might have been nice if we had like a community representative for culture, like an academic half day where they can come and just talk to us a little bit about their culture, when they're like XYZ in a medical appointment or things like that, or tell us about things that they may not be comfortable talking about or things like that, so that we know what to probe gently, what not to, mm-hmm. what to react to or what not to, knowing that not everybody is the same, but mm-hmm. it might be nice if that was the case. The other thing that I think we don't do well at all is when patients do have English as a second language, nobody knows how in the world to get a translator here. Like, how in the world do you do that? I've had to like jump through hoops, and it should not be that hard. They're available. The TELUS, or I think it's TELUS, they have like a translator service. You have to pay for it. And so you need to give them like a hospital billing code, but like, who do you get that from? Or I'm told we have our own translators. Okay. So how do I access them? Nobody knows. Mm-hmm. Right. And these are conversations that we have are very important. Some of it, like, they're always important, but I mean, like, especially like the ones around end of life, what are your goals, that kind of stuff. And like in my situation the other day when the son was like, I don't think my dad understands anything. And I was like, well, I think he actually does. And, but, I can't say that for certain. I think that's one thing that we do very poorly. Mm-hmm. So I would say like being like obvious about that, like how to enlist those sorts of things. And then, just being exposed to more cultures. It sounds bad, but like, I think it might help a little bit. Yeah, I don't know.
No, that's great. Like that's wonderful, incredibly insightful too. Second last question. Have you yourself been in a situation where you were directly affected, more so professionally, but also personally, because someone else did not acknowledge or incorporate those domains as it affected you? So like where they didn't acknowledge your differences, didn't acknowledge, the needs that you had to make things equitable, or they didn't invite you to the table.
This might a little bit fit the bill. So when I came back from mat leave, I had to pump. This time around, there's a pump room at the JCC. Great. But when I was in internal medicine, there wasn't really a designated area like that. And I had to, each hospital I went to, I had to email somebody and be like, hey, I have this need. And so at the Juravinski, it was fine. I could just get a call room. At the general, it was fine. I could get a call room or the chief's room. I would just text the chief and be like, I just need to be in here for this time. And they would leave and I would use it. At St. Joe's, I had to share a room with the PAs, and it's a room I couldn't lock. I had to hang a sign on the door, and I definitely got walked in on once. But I always faced away from the door because I knew it was a possibility. But like they were talking with somebody, so it took them a minute to realize like what was going on. I was just like, I'm pumping in here, and they're like, oh, I'm sorry, and like leave, right? And I felt super vulnerable. So like it was weird because it was under the guise of the program being very like helpful by providing me the space, but it was really not a great space to have that happen. And at St. Joe's, I don't know if you remember, the call rooms are like way out in Timbuktu. So that would have been a drag, to go out. So that's one example. I've also been told by a staff that, I need to keep having babies until I have a daughter because you really need a daughter.
Oh my God.
Because they were like, son, they're not going to be helpful when you're older. They're not going to help you go to medical appointments and this and that. I'm like, oh, okay. So that's happened. Let's see, places where I might not have been invited to the table, around COVID, I think, at the start. I think there were a lot of decisions being made for us that would put us at risk. And two specific instances, there was a meeting, I think there was an RPC, not an RPC, one of the staff business meetings or whatever that residents are invited to. And one of the staff was like, well, because the residents, they're younger, they're probably not going to be affected if they get COVID. So like they should be seeing these patients first and not us. And I was like, what? Like, you don't know what's going on with the residents. Some of them may be immunocompromised. You don't know. At the time, when COVID hit, I was actually very early pregnant, and I ended up having an early miscarriage. But like those patients are immunocompromised. But I would not have told anybody at that stage for the exact reason why. Right? I wouldn't have wanted to walk back that, but I didn't tell anybody that. So the next time when I was actually more successfully pregnant, then I ended up getting Henry. I approached one of the staff at like 5 weeks, and I was just like, look, this is my situation. They're talking about redeployment again. Like, what should I do? And they said, talk to your program director, like just let them know and just, they can put you off the list. Right. So that's a situation where I felt like I didn't really have a lot of control. I didn't really know what I should do. And then the other COVID situation, I think I felt that residents were being taken advantage of because we were being used to round on the wards and being pulled from clinics this way and that, and not with a lot of consideration for education in mind. And I understand that it's a pandemic and it's all hands on deck. But that particular staff did not phrase it in such a way that implied that we were all in it together. And so I think those were scenarios in which, I felt like we were not really invited to the table. And I actually, I was in a position as chief at that time to speak up, and I for sure did. And I'm lucky that I was confident enough to do that, because I was able to advocate for something a little bit better. But not everybody would have necessarily been confident in that situation. And me a year earlier may not have been confident, right? After being here for a while, you know people better and that kind of thing. So it could have been different if that had happened to me a year earlier. So those are just a few examples of where somebody like clearly crossed some personal boundaries or made me feel like I couldn't really be a part of the team, or it seemed like they were really helping me out by giving me something to accommodate me, but then it was like actually not the best. Yeah.
And again, it sounds like in those examples, it was a lack of exploring and spending the time and really, taking into account that this is a individual who is going to have individual needs, and these decisions are being made for you, not with you. Which is, there's a direct translation to the patient encounter as well, right? So last question. Is there anything that we've not covered in this interview that you think might be relevant to acknowledge or discuss as it relates to the research topic, namely how oncologists learn about and understand EDI?
That's a really good question. I think the only thing that we have to be careful about is that when we are making changes and maybe trying to get these half days on equity, diversity, and inclusion and things like that, you can't half-ass it. Pardon my language. You can't do it halfway, and you can't just have somebody who looks like me, for example, come and talk about it, because somebody like me may not have a very broad lived experience of that, right? I think it can be falsely lulling to feel like you're doing a good job and pat yourself on the back by learning superficially about it and not really digging into it and getting uncomfortable. I feel like that discomfort is an important part of it, and sitting in it. So I think that I would say programs need to be cautious about saying we've included this as like a half day. A half day, really? So what else are you doing the other days of the year? You know what I mean? I think we just have to be really cautious not to pat ourselves on the back. An example like that is to be like, we're above the States, and everything in the States to me is like, what is going on down there? But that's also going on here. Right. And so it's really easy for us to feel superior as Canadians because everybody views us as friendly and like, it's Canada, But look at the protests that we had in Ottawa.
Yeah.
Right. Do you think a minority group would have been able to do that for as long as they did with no repercussions or anything? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's happening here. And I think it's really easy to only go part way and make you feel like you've done a good job. So I would just say that we just need to exercise caution and recognize it's going to be a lifelong process, right? I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it is. It is. I strong agree. Strong, kudos to that.
Strong cosign?
Strong cosign. All right. So brilliant. I will pause our recording at this point.